Those are the people that are delegated those responsibilities on campuses.
Ms. Carrion, is it true or isn't it true that what the board was told was that it was Dr. Jeffries who initiated the discussion about leave or about sabbatical, and that that was the extent of his discussion with Dean Rosen and Provost Pfeffer?
I really don't recall.
All right. I want to concentrate on Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair, your knowledge of that based on whatever it was that was presented to you. And that's what I'd like for us to concentrate on.
Okay.
At the meeting on October 28, 1991, what was presented to the board relative to his performance as chairman of the Department of Black Studies?
There was a presentation by President Holliston where he expressed concern about the state of affairs in that department. There were no great details provided. It is not the custom to do so. As trustees, we rely on the information that is provided by the president. He shared with us his concerns and made a recommendation, and we acted on that recommendation.
So he shared with you only his general concerns? He gave you no concrete, specific evidence?
He shared with us information. I'm trying to recall to the best of my ability now what kinds of information I recall. I would not have this information otherwise, other than from President Holliston during that discussion. I recall that he raised to us the issues of the lack of scholarship in the department, the failure of Professor Jeffries to publish. Those were the kinds of things that I recall. I don't recall an extended conversation on any one particular item, nor would have been usual for us to have that information.
But is it usual to spend 4 hours talking about the appointment of any one chair anyway? So weren't you in an unusual circumstance?
Well, it's not usual for chairs to make the kinds of statements that Professor Jeffries made.
No,
so you're absolutely right. This was a different, extraordinary situation. You are right.
And it was made extraordinary because of the statements he made, is that correct?
Absolutely. That was the spotlight. That focused attention on all the ills of the world at City College. That gave everyone...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. On all the ills of the world? Is that what you said?
At City College. Everyone focused attention on anything and everything that ever happened at City College, and we were the focus of media attention. So if you know, security was poor, that became an issue. It put the focus and spotlight on everybody at the university.
All right, but...
That's unfortunate, but that's what happened.
All right, but be that as it may, the reality is that whatever else existed at City College, Dr. Jeffries had nothing to do with that. Isn't that correct? Isn't it? Whatever other ills there may have been, poor security, problems with students, tuition, Dr. Jeffries had nothing to do with that. Isn't that correct?
You're probably right.
The City University was under a microscope at that time.
That's
correct. It is not Dr. Jeffries who shines the light on City College's problems. Isn't that correct?
Well...
I'm talking about problems that he has nothing to do with.
Well, it was what precipitated the sunlight was the professor's statements. It just as when Professor Levin made his statements, that focused the sunlight on that campus also. It is like when we increased tuition, the world looked at us, why students took over buildings. So there are always events that precipitate attention at the university and require us to engage in discussions, and that's what happens.
So Ms. Carrion, as a trustee, shouldn't you be happy when the light shines on the university and points out the dirt and the problems? Because now you have something to focus on. Shouldn't you be happy when that happens?
No, I don't think we should be happy.
You'd rather the dirt be kept in the shadow?
Finish your answer, Your Honor.
Well, had you finished your answer?
No, I had not, Judge.
Well, Your Honor, all I required was a yes or a no.
Well, let me just ask you, if you could, to try and answer Mr. Fleming's questions. Yes or no, if it's susceptible to a yes or no. Now, if giving a yes or no answer would distort the full, true response that you are obligated to give, then of course you may respond in a more comprehensive way. So would you bear that distinction in mind then, Ms. Carrion? Thank you. Do you want to say anything further now
Yes.
in response to the pending question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I think problems at the university should rise during the normal course of business of the university. It is the job of the chancellor and the presidents to tell us what the problems are. It is not for the press or anyone else to uncover dirt. I don't think that's effective management.
But if the chancellor and the president fail to uncover the dirt, and it happens to be uncovered by the newspapers or anything else, do the trustees turn their back on a problem?
Absolutely not.
All right. Are you aware of the resolution of the Faculty Senate condemning any effort to punish Dr. Jeffries as a result of his speech?
Yes, I am.
And was the board aware of that resolution when it considered Dr. Jeffries' chairmanship on the 28th of October?
I know I was aware of it.
Was the rest of the board aware of it, do you know?
My sense is that they probably were.
Was it discussed at all?
I don't recall specifically if it was discussed. I know we were sent that resolution in the mail. The faculty mailed a copy to all of us.
Was the board aware of the results of the investigation that Dr. Holliston asked Provost Pfeffer to conduct?
At what point was the initial investigation, sir?
The investigation that concluded with a report dated October 4, 1991.
I would need more information to refresh my recollection on that.
Well, let me ask you this. During the discussion of President Holliston's recommendation and Chancellor Reynolds' recommendation, did they share with the board any information, whether verbal or written, relative to Provost Pfeffer's official findings following the direction that he engaged in that investigation with respect to Dr. Jeffries?
I don't recall.
You don't recall. You were aware at the time that you were in the board meeting that President Holliston had requested this review, were you not?
Yes.
And were you
I
not
must have
curious as to what the result of that review was?
I'm sure I must have been. I'm trying to recall. I'm trying to place the report, quite frankly.
Okay,
in
well,
my...
do you recall reading anything at all during that board meeting? Was anything presented to the board for their reading pleasure?
I don't think so, but I can't specifically recall. We're giving lots of material.
You were given some material.
No, we usually are at meetings.
Okay.
I can't recall specifically what material we were given here.
But so you don't recall being given any material specifically related to Dr. Jeffries on the 28th of October, 1991?
I don't recall being given written material.
Do you recall any other board members discussing any material or the result of any report relative to Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair?
I don't recall.
So are you saying then that the only information provided to the board relative to Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair was Dr. Holliston's general statement about lack of scholarship and lack of publication? Was that it?
Based on my recollection, what I remember best is President Holliston's verbal oral report to us. That is not an unusual occurrence
Oh, I know
at our
that.
meetings. But that's what I recall to the best of my ability. I'm trying to search my memory.
But I need you to answer my question, though, and I want to be sure. During his verbal presentation to the board, did he cover any other topics other than his perception as to the lack of scholarship in the department and his perception as to the lack of publication?
I don't recall.
Now, you're an attorney, you say, right?
Yes, I am.
And you were aware of the controversy surrounding Dr. Jeffries.
That's
You were
correct.
aware at that time of the decision in the matter of Levin versus Holliston, were you not?
Yes.
And you were aware of the impact and the implications of that decision with respect to First Amendment rights, were you not?
Yes.
And you were aware of the impact and implications of that decision with respect to the university's actions against employees who speak out. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you're telling me that that board, in considering Dr. Jeffries' situation, which was the biggest thing facing the board at that time, I'm sure, asked no questions about any specifics?
I can't recall with any greater detail than what I've shared with you.
You said that the speech caused you to focus on the department. How did you focus on the department?
It was brought to our attention by President Holliston.
Okay, and then what focus then did that cause?
President,
What focus? What exactly was the focus? I mean, you're describing a focus, so please describe that to us.
President Holliston recommended an assessment period to us to review the functioning of the department.
And what was that period to cover? What time frame?
It was a year.
And what was the purpose of that year's period? Was it a probation period?
No, we never discussed probation.
So what was it then? I mean, if you're going to focus on his activities, if it's not probation or something akin to that, then what's the purpose of a year to look at his activities?
Wanted to see whether or not he was running that department effectively and whether he had the ability to strengthen that department. There
And
was a
how-
prior concern as to the fact that that department was languishing, and his concern was, you know, we had a concern that was expressed to us by the president.
All right, there was prior concern, but nothing concrete presented to you. So the board agreed that there would be a year's period in which there would be an assessment as to whether or not he could perform. Did that mean, and was it your understanding, that if he showed that he could perform within that period of time, that he would continue as chair?
Yes,
So if he did perform, he would continue as chair?
yes,
All right, so you expected then at some point to receive some information that would determine whether or not he did perform. Is that correct?
No.
No?
No,
Then how would you know then?
because I would accept the recommendation of the president. That's how we do the business of the university. I would not expect to have a detailed report on personnel matters. I would expect to have a recommendation from the president via the chancellor. That's not uncommon.
Not uncommon. You did say, however, that this was an uncommon situation. It was at least unusual. Isn't that right?
It was not unusual. It was not unusual. As I shared earlier, we have great controversies at the university. We have students taking over buildings, holding other students hostage, increasing tuition. Lots of controversy at the university.
But are any of those things the same thing as a personnel matter involving a chairman of a department who's been a chairman for 20 years, who made a controversial speech, and whose activities are now being investigated immediately following that speech? Do you have anything that's akin to that?
We had Levin, we had tuition,
what
we had
happened with
tuition buildings taken over, university closed down for 2 weeks. A chair in the scheme of the life of the university is not a major position. It is not something that would require our attention. So
But you paid a lot of attention to it, though,
we
didn't
paid a
you?
lot of attention
All right, so let me
because
ask you
the
this.
press paid a lot of attention to it.
So the press led you to it then, is that it? The press made you do it? Is that what you're saying?
No, the press didn't make us do anything. If we had not heard of the speech, if the press had not put the speech on the front page of every newspaper in the city and every television station, we would have not known of the speech.
We'll take a commercial break. Important testimony, of course. We'll come back to more of it right after these messages and bring you an update as well.
This Court TV news break is brought to you by doctor-recommended Preparation H. More people use it because it works.
Hello, I'm Kim Acker with a Court TV news break. Prosecutors have once again asked to move the retrial of a suspended Miami police officer charged with manslaughter. William Lozano's trial has recently scheduled to begin in Orlando on May 10th. Prosecutors say Miami is the only city where a multi-ethnic jury can be seated in this racially sensitive case. The retrial site has been moved 5 times. In 1989, Officer William Lozano shot and killed 2 black men as they were coming towards him on a motorcycle. Several days of rioting followed the shooting. Lozano was convicted of manslaughter, but an appeals court overturned that verdict. Court TV plans to cover the retrial live. The Justice Department has issued subpoenas for records from the Illinois Democratic Party involving Congressman Dan Rostenkowski. The head of the House Ways and Means Committee is under investigation for his alleged involvement in the House post office scandal. Attorney General Janet Reno has vowed not to drop the investigation of the powerful Democratic leader. The former food service manager for an order of nuns in Indiana has pleaded guilty to stealing $570,000. Margaret Dower skimmed the money from the Marriott Corporation, which operated the food service for the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods. Dowers wrote to the Marriott posing as a nun. She made up a story saying financial problems were keeping the order from paying on time. Dowers kept the money. Dowers has agreed to pay the money back to Marriott. That's the Court TV News. I'm Kim Acker.
I saw my doctor because the pain was so bad. I was afraid I needed surgery for my hemorrhoids. I was itching. The burning was awful. But my doctor said my hemorrhoids weren't serious. I didn't need surgery. He told me it was time I started using Preparation H.
Preparation H helps relieve the symptoms of inflamed hemorrhoidal tissues, often bringing relief from itching, burning, and painful irritation for hours.
What a difference Preparation H makes.
Doctor recommended Preparation H.
This quality adjustable bed costs 50% less than these 3 quality flatbeds. 50% less. Yet Craftmatic offers these advantages over flatbeds. First, it adjusts electrically at the touch of a button, so you can read in bed, watch TV in bed, snack, chat on the phone, do a crossword puzzle, and relax and sleep in wonderful comfort. Plus, if you suffer from low back pain or edema or swelling of the legs, unlike any ordinary flatbed, an adjustable bed may temporarily provide relief. Call toll-free to receive this free adjustable bed catalog by mail. Get the facts about the adjustable bed that costs 50% less than all 3 of these quality flatbeds. 50% less. Call for your free catalog now.
Call toll-free 1-800-942-4400. That's 1-800-942-4400 toll-free. 1-800-942-4400.
What I gather and trying to remember is a situation where there was a preliminary investigation by the provost right after the speech.
Well, let me ask you this. As a trustee, would you have expected the chief administrative officer of the college to put before the board the fact that, however preliminary, Professor Jeffries had been given at least a tentative affirmative rating that he was conducting the department in an adequate way? As a trustee, wouldn't you have expected the president of the college to have told you that?
If he had that information, yes.
And as far as you can recollect at this time, he did not tell you that?
I can't remember whether he did or not, sir.
Ms. Carrion, what I'd like to do is to have you read the memorandum from Provost Pfeffer to Dr. Harleston. And if after reading it you can determine whether or not any of that information was provided to you during his presentation to the board, and if it had been provided, whether it would have impacted upon your decision at that time. All right? May I, Your Honor?
Yes.
Okay.
Very important testimony here in the trial at this point. This is the trustee of the university. She's reviewing some documents. The judge just weighed in with a question which sounded to us back here uptown in New York to be suggesting that he found this bit of testimony a bit incredible. Ron Green, you're here with me uptown. What's your thought?
This trial is going in the wrong direction for the City University of New York. It's inexplicable that a witness would get on the stand and be led as she has been led in cross-examination without hardly an objection from her counsel. It's almost as if, this being a First Amendment case where everyone's so concerned about freedom of speech, no one wants to be the one to rise up and say, we shouldn't hear that.
It's an interesting observation. I wonder whether it isn't. You said you've never heard so few evidentiary objections in a proceeding which was as important and significant as this.
An awful lot of argumentative questioning and cross-examination, which typically isn't tolerated when there's a jury. And I'm surprised that objection hasn't been made.
Now, on the point that the judge was making, which I take it to be essentially the trustee said she doesn't recall the president making either a written or a verbal report about this inquiry about whether or not Jeffries was doing his job right after the speech. And the judge said, hold it, don't you need to know that in order to know what to do?
The fact that the judge intervened in a case which is not a bench trial in the presence of the jury is unusual and have a tremendous impact on the jury's perception of her credibility. To the extent the judge looks as if he doesn't believe it, the jury will certainly inherit that disbelief.
We're panning back in the courtroom to the defense table. Of course, these lawyers who represent the city, and you see President Harleston sitting there, the lawyers who are representing the university and the city college here are all from the Attorney General's office. Mr. Colucci, who you see on the far side here, is a Deputy Attorney General, and he questioned most of the witnesses on direct. Let's talk a little bit about the merits of what she said, since she's still not testifying yet. It seems to me that she volunteered quite a bit of information so far on cross, which isn't the right idea. On a cross-examination, one's lawyer usually says, answer the question as briefly and as succinctly as you possibly can. Don't give them anything.
One of the problems we have here is that this witness is a lawyer, and lawyers make horribly poor witnesses. In addition, she made certain statements about advice she and her trustees received from counsel, which probably have waived the attorney-client privilege, which may now permit Mr. Fleming to call as rebuttal witness, if necessary, the attorney that sat in on those meetings and gave advice to these trustees.
A big possible hole here if Mr. Fleming decides to use it, a big weapon against the defense if he decides to play that card. Let's go back to court. I guess is she still reading or talking? Looks to me if we've got a read back going on here. Let's just listen.
On the memo from Provost Pfeffer to Dr. Harleston, and if after reading it you can determine whether or not any of that information was provided to you during his presentation to the board, and if it had been provided, whether it would have impacted upon your decision at that time.
I think, yes, some of this information was provided to us.
Okay, what information was provided to you?
Some of the findings here,
And what were those findings that were provided to the board?
the term of the investigation and the fact that period that was being evaluated, and the fact that it was the opinion that for this period of time Jeffries was performing his duties. After reading this, I think we were told that, or I somehow have a sense I knew that.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so now you recall having been told that Dr. Jeffries was performing well as of at least October 28, 1991. As of the date of your board meeting then, isn't it true that you had nothing before you that you could rely upon as concrete evidence to show that Dr. Jeffries was not performing well as chair as of that date?
I don't think we required that.
No, I'm not asking you what you required. I'm asking you what was actually before you at that time. Did you have anything before the board on the night of October 28, 1991, that allowed the board to reach a concrete conclusion that Dr. Jeffries had not been performing well as chair up to that date?
Your Honor, the question assumes the fact and evidence that the board did in fact reach such a conclusion. I think you ought to rephrase the question.
Rephrase the question, would you, Mr. Fleming?
Sure. What did the board have before it other than the conclusions contained in this report relative to Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair up to the 28th of October, 1991?
We had a representation by President Holliston that he needed additional time to conduct an assessment. That's what we had. There was not a finding of fault. There was a request for additional time.
Okay, so what I need, though, is this, and I just want to be clear. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just need to be clear that there was nothing else presented to you relative to his performance prior to October 28, 1991.
Prior to that date,
Yes.
there was nothing presented to us on his performance.
Okay, I think maybe I'm still not clear. So you had the results of a report dated October 4, 1991, and you said that that was related to you by President Holliston. Is that correct?
At that meeting.
At that meeting, that's what I'm asking.
So prior to that meeting, I didn't have anything.
At that meeting, that's what was presented to you. At that meeting, did President Holliston or Chancellor Reynolds tell you anything else about any other conclusion as to Dr. Jeffries' performance at that time? Not what they thought was going to happen the next day or what they were concerned about tomorrow, but what they actually had as of that date relative to his performance.
Other than the concern that they were expressing and the need for additional time?
Yes, other than the concern, other than any prospective circumstance. What information did you have relative to his performance other than the conclusion of Provost Pfeffer?
The representations made by President Holliston.
Were those representations prospective?
No, they were not prospective.
Were they relative to something that had already occurred?
President Holliston expressed reservations about the ability of Professor Jeffries to effectively serve as chair. That information that was provided for us is very limited in nature. It doesn't
Why is it
preclude.
limited?
The report itself, when you read it, is very tentative for the period of time, tentative as to his findings, and it was all very couched in very tentative language. It doesn't preclude, it says for this period of time we found that the department was operating. That doesn't preclude having concerns about the quality of scholarship, of wanting to explore that further. And that's what was shared with us. I don't think that that is the definitive statement of state of affairs of that department. That's why I'm having the difficulty I am having.
You're having.
I am telling you that we relied on the representations that were made by the president, where he came to us and said, we need additional time for an assessment. I was very sure and very confident that if the president found that the performance was adequate, Professor Jeffries would be reappointed.
You were confident of that?
Yes, I was.
And you were confident that you would support that reappointment. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Let me ask you this. Provost Pfeffer says in his report, in conclusion, my review of Professor Jeffries' leadership of the Black Studies Department since July 1, 1991, indicates that he is fulfilling the duties of a chair as written in Article 9.3 of the CUNY bylaws. 9.3 of the CUNY bylaws. Evidence gathered from the dean, the social science P&B, and the Black Studies departments indicates that Professor Jeffries has been reasonably and responsibly performing those duties delineated, including scheduling courses, presiding over departmental meetings, recruiting faculty, keeping departmental records, representing the department at P&B and faculty council, etc. If that's the conclusion of Dr. Jeffries' performance since the date of his re-election as chair, what other information did you have? What other concrete did you have that showed that he was not performing well as chair?
We had the representations of the president of the college.
As to his scholarship and as to publications, those are the only two things you've mentioned. Is that it?
Those are the two things that I recall. And what I also recall was the scholarship, publication, and the status of the department.
What was the status of the department that was related to you?
Its reputation in the field.
And what was its reputation that was related to you?
That it was not thought of well in other circles.
By whom? What information did they give you to support that information?
A representation by the president.
And that was it?
That's what we pay him for.
That's what you pay him for?
That's right.
Let me ask you this. With respect to scholarship, scholarship means what? What does scholarship mean? What did it mean to you when it was presented to you by the president?
It meant research. It meant being published, creating curriculum, creating things like research.
Okay, and so the board heard that. Did any board member bother to ask a question about that? Did any board member bother to say, are there any publications out of the department? How many publications are there?
I think that probably was part of the discussion.
Do you know? Do you know?
Yes, that was asked. I remember asking. I remember asking, are there any books that Professor Jeffries has published?
And what was the answer to that?
I think the answer I received was no.
No books at all?
That was my recollection.
Right. What does, assuming that's correct, that he has published no books, what does that have to do with his function as chair?
It has to do functioning as particularly as chair is a leadership position where you inspire others to follow, that you provide the leadership, you inspire them, you're a role model, you set forward what the standards of the department should be.
And where is that in the bylaws that a chair must publish?
It is inherent in the position of a faculty member of a university. That's what an academy...
Of a faculty member. Where is it in the bylaws that a chair must publish? You recall what I said to you? Hold on.
Right.
You recall that I indicated to you?
May I just interrupt? I think the court reporter is having some difficulty recording this examination. So may I ask both of you, I ask the witness, now you're a lawyer, may I suggest you sit back, listen to counsel's questions, reflect upon them, and give the best answer you can. Please don't cut him off, and by the same token, Mr. Fleming, I ask you to wait for the witness to finish and do not cut her off. I think in deference to the jury, this is a procedure that's really essential. So please, both of you, bear that in mind. Go ahead, Mr. Fleming.
My apologies, Your Honor. Article 9.3 of the bylaws contains the duties and responsibilities of the chair. Is that correct?
If you say so. I don't know.
Are you not familiar with Article 9.3 of the bylaws?
We have a lot of bylaws. I don't have them memorized.
Listen, just say no. If a no will answer the question, just say no. Would you? Would you?
Yes.
They're looking up the bylaw here. Ron Green, you're in agony. Why?
I'm going to show you section 9.
I wish I had a mic on that could be heard in the court and so I could object when her lawyer ought to be objecting. But she's being led by a leash by a very good lawyer, and she's not being protected by her own, and that's unfortunate.
Let's go back into the courtroom. Professor Jeffries, the plaintiff in this matter, conferring with another one of his attorneys in the courtroom. Apparently, Article 9 is being reviewed by the witness. If you're just joining us, she's a trustee at the the City University of New York, which has responsibility for City College. Ron, while she's looking at this, a couple of other points here. Your feeling is that the pace of this cross-examination, which the judge just interceded on, she was really, as they say on the train here. He's really got her just from a plaintiff's point of view where he wants her at this point.
I think that's true, and he's already essentially made a lot of her testimony his own, deliberately so, by getting her to concede early on that as an attorney and as a member of the Board of Trustees and upon the advice of her counsel, what Professor Jeffries said could play no role in their evaluation of him as department chair.
And so he's got her into a position now where she's saying the report turned in by the provost provided no further indication that Jeffries shouldn't remain as chairman, and what she had prior to that was President Hurlston saying that scholarship, publication, and the status of the department were the issues. It's a tough box. She's answering the questions. Let's listen. Question here is whether or not the bylaws require a chairman to publish. They do not.
You said that following the October 28, 1991 board meeting, there was an expectation that there would be a continuing review of Dr. Jeffries' performance. Is that correct?
No.
There was no expectation that they would continue to review Dr. Jeffries' performance after the 28th of October?
The president was going to engage in an assessment. How he was going to do that is up to the president.
All right. So you wouldn't call it a review, you would call it an assessment. All right. And was it your expectation that the president would report back to the board at some point as to the results of that assessment?
I would expect a recommendation. I don't expect a report.
Did you, or any other member of the board that you're aware of, make any effort to really determine what the status of the Black Studies Department was?
That is not our function, no.
All right. So you relied exclusively on the information provided to you by President Hurlston, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And now, most of that information was general in nature, though, was it not?
Based on my recollection, yes.
You said that you felt that Dr. Jeffries had a right to speak, that despite your personal reaction to the speech, that you believe that his constitutional rights allowed him to make those statements. Was that correct?
Yes.
If in fact that was so, and in light of the Levin decision, which was discussed at your board meeting on the 28th, why did the board agree to reduce his term to 1 year and to allow a continuing review or assessment of his performance?
The president, that was the president's recommendation that was endorsed by the chancellor based on concerns that he had about the status of that department. It was not, in my opinion, related to the speech.
President Hurlston, Chancellor Reynolds, Dean Rosen, and Provost Pfeffer have all indicated that if it were not for the speech, there never would have been a review in the first place. So if the speech had not occurred, there would not have been a review. Dean Rosen's understanding, and tell me if I'm right or wrong in terms of your understanding of a dean's position. Dean Rosen did not need the speech to give him any information as to the status of the department, did he?
That's correct.
And Provost Pfeffer did not need the speech to give him any information as to the status of the department, did he?
That's correct.
Because their jobs are to know what goes on within the college, isn't that correct?
If they're good managers, yes.
Okay, and did you understand them to be good managers?
I didn't really have any information to base that on, whether they were good or bad.
All right. But your understanding of the process for re-electing and confirming the election of chairs is that it comes from the department up through the academic chain of command, is that correct?
That's correct.
It winds up on the president's desk, correct?
That's correct.
And then it comes on to the board, is that correct?
That's correct.
While it climbs up the ladder of the academic chain of command, if the dean or the provost or the president knows of any reason to recommend against that election, is it expected that they will pass that reason on to the board? Or not recommend it for election?
They would not, they wouldn't make a recommendation. It's...
All right, thank you.
We'll take a commercial break. We'll be right back in just a moment with more of this live coverage. Important testimony for both sides.
You can make beautiful drapes like these without sewing a stitch. Yes, you can create this dazzling decor even if you've never made anything before. And you can make new drapes like these for less than the cost of cleaning your old drapes. All with the amazing Designer Drape. It's so simple to use. Watch. Screw in the hook mounts. Lay out your fabric and gather up the center. Now push it through the middle of Designer Drape and fan and fluff that fabric into a beautiful billowing balloon. Isn't that easy? Move section by section out to each end, and in minutes, you've created a gorgeous valance like this. But that's just the beginning. Loop your fabric through the two end sections and watch the miracle unfold as you finish your Designer Drape without sewing a stitch. Use fancy knots, bows, or rosette corner treatments just like the pros. And if you don't like the design or grow tired of the color, change it instantly. Make headboards and drapes out of ready-made sheets so everything's perfectly matched. Or make this fancy shower valance. Join them for big windows or bow them like this for small. You can cut them, bend them, extend them, and best of all, move them when you move. You'll go from this to this in just 8 minutes, or from this to this in less than 30. Yes, you'll turn your home into the envy of your friends almost instantly. And best of all, the entire system with 36-inch Designer Drape, mounting hooks, plus complete step-by-step instructions on dozens of styles is just $9.95. But there's more. Order 2 and we'll include a third Designer Drape free. That's right, free. Here's how to order yours. Use your credit card and call toll-free 1-800-647-9100 now. That's 1-800-647-9100. Or send $9.95 plus $4.95 shipping and handling to Designer Drape, 245 North Ocean Boulevard, Deerfield Beach, Florida. Remember, buy 2, get 1 free. Call 1-800-647-9100.
For the latest verdicts from trials seen on Court TV, call Court TV's verdict line at 212-973-6791.
Well, you didn't miss much during that break. Mr. Fleming is essentially still asking questions about the same ground which has been covered. We're going to go back into the courtroom, of course, for more of this trustee's testimony. Perhaps Mr. Fleming is coming to the end of this. One sense is that unless he has some new points to make, he's probably done what he needs to do. Let's go back into the courtroom.
In this matter, I think it's threatening and prejudicial, and you shouldn't be doing that.
That's nonsense. The objection is overruled. It's an entirely proper question. Go ahead. I said the objection is overruled. It's an entirely proper question.
So did you, as an attorney, as a trustee, have any concern that your action might generate legal action against the university or against you or against the trustees, that you might have personal liability? Didn't you think about that at all?
Well, certainly as a lawyer and as a trustee, I'm always concerned about litigation. University is constantly sued on a variety of issues, and I had to, in my own mind, be clear that this action was not being taken in response to the speech that was made and I was confident.
But how could you have been confident or clear if you never even asked a question of Dr. Holliston that might have given you some idea as to his motives?
Mr. President Holliston represented to us that this was his recommendation to appoint Gordon as chair. We relied on that recommendation. He understood what the law was as well as we did.
How do you know he understood what the law was?
In the course of our meetings, before he was present, we discussed the First Amendment, we discussed academic freedom. I relied on his ability, on his knowledge, on his expertise, that he was making a recommendation to us that was legally appropriate and sustainable.
You were relying upon Dr. Holliston for a legal conclusion?
No, I was relying on his judgment that he was taking action that was not in violation of the law.
But he never gave you anything to back up what was really a decision, was it not, to remove Dr. Jeffries. What did he give you to back that up? Let me back up a second. You said that as of the October 28, 1991 meeting, he had concerns about Dr. Jeffries' ability to do some things in the future, and that there would be an assessment after that as to whether or not he could. I also asked you whether or not, if in fact Dr. Jeffries was able to perform, and if it was found that those concerns were unfounded, whether or not you expected that Dr. Jeffries would continue as chair, and you said yes. Well, here you are on the 23rd of March, 1992. Didn't you want to know the results of that assessment? Didn't you want to know whether or not he had in fact performed as chair up to that time in accordance with the bylaws?
Not particularly.
All right. So you were satisfied to allow Dr. Holliston's judgment to be substituted for yours?
That's how the board functions. We function on recommendations.
Is the answer yes?
Yes.
Okay. I have no further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Redirect?
There will be some redirect here. This, of course, is Mr. Colucci from the Attorney General's office.
As you understood what you were being asked to do at the October 28th, 1991 meeting, did you understand yourself to be as being asked to make an assessment of Dr. Jeffries' performance as of that date?
No, I wasn't.
What was it you thought you were being asked to do?
To act on a recommendation.
Now, the concerns that were expressed to you by Dr. Harleston, did they cover past performance of Professor Jeffries?
Excuse me, would you repeat your question again?
Maybe I should rephrase it. It was awful.
No, there was noise.
Yes. When President Harleston made his recommendation to you and discussed his reasons for it, did he mention, I don't want to get into specifics, but did he mention in general past performance of the department?
Yes.
And did he express concerns about the future performance of the department?
Yes.
And was he asking the trustees to make a decision one way or another on either of those questions?
No.
What was he asking them to do?
He was asking us to support his recommendation.
To do what?
For the October?
Yes, October.
To have additional time to conduct an assessment. He asked us to appoint Dr. Jeffries to a one-year term. And that's what we did.
I have no further questions.
Anything else, Mr. Fleming?
Now, you just said something that requires that I ask you a question that I thought I had gone over with you. When you said that Dr. Harleston provided you with information regarding the department's past performance and his concerns about their future performance. Now, I've asked you already whether or not the information he provided to you about the past performance was what was contained in Provost Pfeffer's memo of October 4, 1991. Is that what you're referring to when you said past performance?
Yes, and,
All right.
and the scholarship and publication and the general status and perception of that department. Those were
But those are-
information that was given to us.
Aren't those two separate things? I'm talking about an assessment of the department's performance. And the only information I understand you to have had regarding the department's performance and Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair is what was contained in Provost Pfeffer's report.
No,
Is that correct or not?
That's not correct.
Well, then what else
my
did you...
testimony was
Hold on, please.
the report.
Hold on, please.
Let Mr. Fleming finish his question. Go ahead, Mr. Fleming.
I'm asking you to separate out this discussion about scholarship and publications. And I'm asking you to focus on the actual performance, Dr. Jeffries' performance as chair, as detailed in the bylaws, specifically section 9.3, which you have had occasion to read here today. What I want to know, and we all want to be sure about this, is whether or not you had any other information other than what was contained in Provost Pfeffer's report regarding his performance as chair relative to 9.3 of the bylaws.
I cannot recall everything, the information that was provided by the president, so I cannot preclude that he gave us information that related to any of the sections of the bylaw as they pertain to the duties of a chair. I can't say that he did not tell us something else.
But you can't say that he did either, can you?
No, I can't.
Thank you.
You may step down. Next witness.
A bruising examination of this witness. We're going to sneak in a commercial break here. We'll be back with the next witness. We expect a break in about 10 or 15 minutes. This woman you're seeing leave the stand is actually a commissioner of the Community Development Agency here in New York. Looks like the judge has decided to take a break. We'll be back with some analysis of all that we've heard right after this. A case effectively. And in a sense, I think perhaps we see two different answers to the question. In a way, the plaintiff's lawyer, Mr. Fleming, who generally does personal injury work or medical malpractice work, seems to have a fine grasp of the dynamics of this courtroom, where the defense, it seems to me, is having a lot of problems handling the courtroom anyway in this circumstance. Does it matter whether you're an expert in the subject matter?
That depends. In this case, there doesn't seem to be any disagreement on what the applicable law is. As a matter of fact, given the testimony of the last witness, a major concession seems to have been made that they not only agree, but at the time of the October meeting, those who made the decision that they would limit Professor Jeffries to perhaps only a one-year extension of his term were aware of the law and agreed fully with how the law is being presented in this case by the plaintiff. So this is a battle really between two trial lawyers. No one has really raised the issue of who knows more substantive law. It doesn't seem to be terribly important, and that battle clearly is being won by Professor Jeffries' lawyer.
So you're saying really, in a way, in part, the ability to communicate with the jury, to make your questions clear, to have pacing, and sort of the generic courtroom skills is, in many cases anyway, just as important as really knowing the law in that area in an expert kind of way.
You're also saying something else. Professor Jeffries' lawyer is a good trial lawyer, and there's just no substitute for courtroom experience if you're going to try a case. This lawyer, Mr. Fleming, is good at what he does. His job is to persuade the jury that what they're hearing from the university is a pretextual defense, that they're not being honest, and he's done a very good job of doing that.
Well, Ms. Carrion, who is a trustee for the university, has a public office herself. She's the Commissioner of Community Development here in the city of New York. She seemed nervous when she first took the stand. Do you have a thought about why? I think we heard a little bit about it later in her testimony.
I think it was her lack of preparation. Her inability to recall critical conversations, critical communications, was hurting her. And when the judge had to intervene and suggest to everyone in that courtroom that he was having trouble believing it, you knew that either she was not telling the truth or she simply wasn't prepared. I think it was the latter, the effect's the same.
Now, let's talk about also the personal risk here. We usually think of people who come in to represent corporations or big entities as not having something personally at stake, and while that may be the result in the real world, it's not necessarily so.
Well, Mr. Fleming made a very good point, and it was consistent with the law when he said to this witness that as a trustee and as a lawyer, she was aware that she faced personal financial exposure should her decision have been found to have been purposefully violative of the civil rights of Professor Jeffries. And she said essentially that she was. That being the case, he follows with questions that suggest anyone in that position would then want to go as far as they could in understanding the facts before they voted. And she seemed to say she didn't care about that. She relied on the unsubstantiated representation by the chancellor or the president that for inexplicable reasons, certainly non-detailed reasons, they were doing something that she was concerned about.
Let's list the specific reasons she mentioned. She said lack of scholarship, she said lack of publishing, and she said lack of credibility of the department or status of the department out in the world. I think both of us agreed that in terms of the publishing and the scholarship questions, those are really questions asked before a faculty member is granted tenure. And I think pretty effectively Mr. Fleming made that point, although I think he might have gone a bit further when he looked at Section 9 of the bylaws and said, I don't see anything about scholarship or publishing here as requirements of the chairmanship.
He also had the benefit of 19 to 20 years of history of Professor Jeffries. During that period of time, no one seemed to raise any questions concerning his publishing or his scholarship. He's had at least one witness to suggest that the appearance of this department to the outside world, its status outside the university's walls, was very good indeed, raising substantial questions of whether this is not just an effort to backfill, that everyone was really concerned about what Professor Jeffries had said in that speech and the public outcry, political and otherwise, about it. That means if they put him on a one-year term for the express purpose of assessing his performance, at the end of that time, everyone who voted to do so would be asking some pretty hard questions. What happened during this year?
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but as we were talking about, it all seems to come back in some sense as if you're going to take out these prior concerns, which actually, I think it was the provost who said on the witness stand, in fact, the mere reality of having been reappointed at this position throughout the years sort of wipes away problems that we actually deal with these issues on an ongoing basis. And while we may not forget this 1985 incident where a faculty member said he wouldn't come because he objected to Professor Jeffries' ideology, that in fact the reappointment subsequent to that suggested that this was not, at least by itself, a major issue, so that in some ways he comes clean.
At the meeting on October 28, 1991?
Yes.
And at that time, didn't Vice Chancellor Diaz discuss the Levin decision?
Yes.
And wasn't the Levin decision discussed in light of the contemplated action against Dr. Jeffries?
I'm not sure in that context that was an agenda item.
Were they considered two separate and unrelated items?
There were two items on the agenda.
Were they considered two separate
I
and
don't know.
unrelated items?
I don't know.
Let's go back to one of the matters you mentioned earlier. That was this situation with Professor Seligson.
Yes.
This was back in 1985, and at that time you found fault with some things that Dr. Jeffries was alleged to have said. Is that correct?
On concern, yes.
Excuse me?
I found concern.
You found concern. I want to refer you to your letter of March 8, 1985. This is Defendant's Exhibit J, Your Honor. And you say that except for the references made by Professor Seligson in his letter, I have not received either from Dean Tamney or from any other source a specific first-hand report quoting statements that were attributed to you and which would define or clarify the allegations of anti-Semitism or racism in Professor Seligson's letter. It is evident to me, however, that whatever the precise content of your comments, they were perceived as creating a strong and enduring perception of anti-Semitic and racist sentiments. Whether this was intended or not, such sentiments or behavior is intolerable and indefensible for individuals charged with officially representing the college or for individuals functioning in a role such as department chair, which makes them representatives of the college. You conclude your letter by saying there can be no further instances in which you, in your leadership role, create through insensitive comments or remarks the perception that the college supports racial or ethnic bigotry. Such actions are inconsistent with responsible leadership. Now, you're referring in that letter to statements he had made. Is that correct?
May I see the letter? I don't
Certainly.
have to see the context. Thank you.
Sure.
The president referring to a letter that he had written to the plaintiff in this matter. It sure sounds to me, Ron Green, as if this is exactly what they want to stay away from, which was an evaluation of the content of his speaking. You agree with that?
Absolutely.
We'll see whether or not, some way, it's possible to distinguish the speech and his beliefs from this apparent reprimand from the president about speaking out in such a fashion. He's going to have to be able to look at the effects, I think, as you've suggested.
We're going to have to see if Professor Harleston now says it was not so much that the subject happened to be racially sensitive, but that he chose to take a podium to put the spotlight on himself, create a controversy of some type, which impaired his ability to function. It wasn't so much what the subject was.
Right. Can it just be a distension within the community? Is that enough? Or does it have to be that his own, well, it looks like they're going to, I'll wait, save the question, it looks like they're going to start again.
Now, my question, Dr. Harleston, was whether or not this letter and the concerns you expressed in this letter were related to statements Dr. Jeffries had made at that time.
Yes.
Okay. And you warned him at that time, did you not, that there can be no further instances of such comments or remarks?
Yes.
And did you